This is all about self-neglect. And in October this year, Cumbria Safeguarding Adults Board published new guidance on practice around self-neglect. It's a multi-agency guidance, and it's for people, practitioners in all agencies who are supporting adults who have care and support needs, who are at risk of harm arising from their self-neglecting behaviours. So this session is really to just partly introduce that guidance, but we're also intending to kind of pick out the key themes for people in their practice. This guidance is multi-agency, but it's important to remember that each organisation who are part of the board will have their own operational policies as well, and it's important that practitioners are aware of and do refer to those in their practice too. So just to start with, what do we actually mean by self-neglect? It's a very broad term, rightly so. It is used to describe some very widely differing behaviours and the ways that people have developed that may be a way of living their lives, different ways of coping with circumstances, which might be current circumstances, or they may relate to historic experience that they've had that have kind of resulted in people developing different coping mechanisms. There's one definition we've put here, which is from the statutory guidance from the DHSC. That's from last year. So this defines self-neglect as a wide range of behaviours, neglecting to care for one's personal hygiene, health or surroundings, and it includes behaviour such as hoarding. It's important for all of us when we're working alongside somebody who's self-neglecting to be aware that the term is very subjective. So there isn't one definition that's right or wrong. It's also important to really be respectful of the fact that the person concerned may not recognise it as something that reflects their circumstances. They may not use it themselves to describe their situation. They may not see things in the same way. So whilst it's important for us from a professional point of view to understand what we're talking about and how that relates to national frameworks such as the Care Act, if we're keeping our practice really person-centred, we need to be very aware of how the person understands their situation and the kind of language that they use to describe and define it. So what does the research tell us about working with people who are self-neglecting? There are 3 slides here where I've focused on some of the key research themes. So this first one is about some of the challenges for practitioners. What do we know about how that is? It's challenging for practitioners often because of its complex and varied presentation. So as we've said, everybody is an individual, and whilst you may see some common environmental impacts, for example, within somebody's home, it is a very individual presentation, and our responses to that need to take full account of that. It's challenging because of the risk of harm that there potentially or actually is within the person's situation, either to themselves or to other people. Intervention by professionals, whether that's you as an individual or whether there's a number of agencies working together to support the person, that intervention may not necessarily be welcomed. And possibly that links us back to the earlier point about the person not recognising the situation that they're in as a self-neglectful one. So they may just be in a different place than we are. There may well be challenges around assessing the person's mental capacity for decision making about the way in which they're living. Very often for practitioners, there are really significant ethical dilemmas where you are being asked to fulfil statutory duties under the Care Act, for example, and respecting the person's autonomy and their wishes and feelings. We do hear from practitioners that lack of resources may be a challenge, and practitioner time. I think we would all understand that for most, if not all, self-neglect situations, the approach that's required is likely to take a long time. It isn't something that is a quick fix, if I can use that phrase. So being able to find and maintain the level of time that's required to support the person appropriately can be difficult for practitioners. And the final point there is the challenges that we might experience around collaborating across different agencies, where there are different roles and responsibilities, and probably all of those agencies and individuals are experiencing similar difficulties in finding sufficient time and resources to be able to support the person appropriately. What we also know from research is that practice with people who are self-neglecting is most effective when practitioners can work at the person's pace and have the time to be able to build relationships, build rapport, and build trust with the person. That's the first point I've made there, and I think that's deliberate. That probably underpins everything that we do. It's really good when we can seek to understand the meaning behind the person's self-neglect. So not just thinking about or asking questions about what's going on, but that kind of deeper process that is really about why. What might be some of the triggers, what might be some of the historical circumstances that have led a person to be living their life in the way that they are currently. So not just what's going on, but those deeper conversations about, tell me about what's been happening for you, tell me about how were things different. Yeah, all of that deeper assessment and relationship building. When we carry out very thorough assessments of care and support needs, and when we constantly review and keep in mind, I think, the consideration of the person's mental capacity for decision making. That isn't something that can be done as a one-off. I think particularly when we're thinking about self-neglect, that's absolutely something that should be in the forefront of our minds when we're working with people. The practice is most effective when we comprehensively risk assess and when we work collaboratively also with those risk assessments and risk mitigation plans. When we communicate openly and honestly with the person about what our concerns are and what our perspective might be, and that's without judgment. And how can we best support effective practice? Well, when strategic responsibility for self-neglect is located within that multi-agency framework and governance of the Safeguarding Adults Board, which is another reason why we really welcome the publication of this multi-agency guidance. When agencies work together around support, risk assessments and decision making, so that those sorts of responsibilities are not solely located with an individual practitioner. There may be one person who, and that might be a social worker, it might be another person. So there may be one person who is primarily working with the person who's self-neglecting, but it's really important that that person is not the only person who's doing that work and the only person who's responsible for those risk assessments. So when longer term relationship based work is understood and supported as best practice who self-neglect, so that organisations support practitioners appropriately to be able to undertake pieces of work that are going to take a long time over a long period of time. And when training and supervision is available to practitioners to provide that supportive and reflective space, so that people have the opportunity to reflect on their own feelings as well and their own practice, and to really work through some of those difficult ethical, legal challenges, work out next steps. I think that that is absolutely fundamental to good practice for the person who's self-neglecting, but it's absolutely crucial so that the practitioner feels appropriately supported in being able to undertake that work in the best way that they possibly can. And there's a reference there. So this research is conducted by Professor Susie Bray, who's done a huge amount of work around self-neglect and safeguarding. So some of the contributing factors in self-neglect. This isn't an absolute list. These are some of the things which may or may not be contributing factors for somebody finding themselves in a situation where they're self-neglecting. These are probably some of the more common themes that I think we might see when we're supporting people. So issues around low mood, depression, low self-esteem. Again, these are things that probably, though not necessarily, may have had a gradual, cumulative effect, if you like, over a period of time. People may have very particular views on hygiene, personal hygiene, or order within their own home or within their own life. There is a huge spectrum there that all of us are on. We will all have views about the way that we like things to be, how we need things to be. We're all on that spectrum, and people who are self-neglecting are no different. They will choose to place themselves somewhere on that spectrum, and our role is to understand what that means for them. There may well be some commonalities around a person's response to possibly historical current trauma, loss, or abuse. Some of that may well go back to the person's childhood, and there may have been a single event which has triggered some responses. There may have been long-standing and sustained experience of trauma in a person's life, and it's really important to, in a meaningful professional relationship, to really be able to use all of your skills in terms of listening, your professional curiosity, in terms of asking questions, remembering what a person's told you, and be able to have conversations about those sorts of things to help you understand why the person may be in their current situation, not just that they are. So the person may have experienced, I've missed one out, haven't I? So we've talked before, I think, about the coping mechanisms that people develop in response to experience of trauma or abuse, or the next point, challenging social and material circumstances, poor nutrition. We all develop coping mechanisms to manage the circumstances and difficulties that we find ourselves in, and people who are self-neglecting are no different. People may have experienced losses around social support and financial stability. And there's a whole range of things that people might have experienced there, whether that's a loss of family members, a close personal relationship, wider social support or neighbours, and all of the challenges that might come around a loss of material stability and income and financial challenges generally. Person may have experienced changes in their physical and or mental health, or both. And often, though not necessarily always, alcohol or substance misuse may be a factor in the person's circumstances. You may see some of those, you may see none of those. It really is very individual, and again, that's very much about working with and understanding the person's situation as it applies to them. So we're thinking here about what sort of support and interventions may be available to the person. This is just to set the scene really in terms of the Care Act and the role of safeguarding adult boards. So the Care Act in 2014 provided a broad definition of what do we mean by adults who are in need of care and support, and what are the duties owed to them. So there's now a requirement to have safeguarding adult boards who have a statutory role in helping and supporting adults who have care and support needs, who are experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, and are unable by virtue of those care and support needs to protect themselves. The Care and Support Statutory Guidance to the Care Act, so that was most recently updated in 2020, includes self-neglect within the list of circumstances that we understand as constituting abuse or neglect. And it also makes it really clear that working in a person-centred and solution-focused way is absolutely at the heart of how we make safeguarding personal, because it's not just something to talk about doing, it's something that we need to be able to translate into practice. And how are we actually making safeguarding personal? We work in a really person-centred way. So in terms of responding to self-neglect, when we're working with people who are self-neglecting, it absolutely will involve an ongoing dynamic risk assessment of harm and the risk that the person may be facing or experiencing. As I said before, alongside with the mental capacity, this isn't something that can be done as a one-off event. It absolutely, dynamic is the key word there. It needs to be part and parcel of all of the work that we're doing with the person all of the time. We have the Safeguarding Adults Thresholds tool and guidance, which is really helpful. It seeks to support practitioners, partners and providers working in the adult sector to understand their roles and responsibilities in terms of reporting, responding to concerns at the appropriate level, and so that we have a consistency of approach across agencies. So the guidance isn't a substitute for professional judgment. It's there really to assist your decision making and assist multi-agency decision making, and to support that professional judgment. It can't possibly, nor should it, provide specific advice and guidance about every individual circumstance and person that we're going to come across. So that's where the professional judgment comes in, because that's very bespoke, if you like, in terms of what we know, working alongside the person and keeping them in a person-centred way right at the heart of our making safeguarding personal approach. We know that there have been, sadly, a number of safeguarding adult reviews over time that have concerned themselves around self-neglect, and it is important that we learn from the key themes there and try and incorporate those into our current practice, so that if things could have been done differently in the past, we understand what that means for us now, and we don't want to make those same sorts of mistakes. So I am sure that many of these are not going to be a surprise to people on the call, but I think it's important that we just look at those again. And the first one always is about the importance of early information sharing. And it's particularly important to remember that that relates to not just a current concern that we might be looking at with a person, but we should also be really aware of previous concerns that have been raised about a person. So again, that's where our professional curiosity is absolutely critical. It's not just about understanding what's happening now, but going a little bit deeper on what's happened previously. What do we know about what's happened before? Are there other people who might have some information about this? Are there people who might not, but need to have the information about this? The importance of thorough and robust risk assessment and planning. We've touched on this earlier, but it's absolutely crucial to just kind of underline that and again stress the importance of the dynamic risk assessment element to this. The importance of face-to-face working and reviews. I would absolutely, despite all of the challenges that we have, particularly currently around managing COVID risks, I think it's absolutely essential that when we're working particularly with people who are self-neglecting, the need for face-to-face assessment, reviews, and just ongoing professional support and relationships is absolutely critical. There's a very clear need for for interfacing with the safeguarding adult procedures, in understanding the importance of effective collaboration between agencies, which again the guidance will underlines, and understanding the different legislative options available that there are to intervene to safeguard a person who's self-neglecting. And again, that goes back to the multi-agency approach and the different roles and responsibilities of other agencies. So housing, for example, environmental health. We won't go through all of those now because it very much depends on the person's individual circumstances as to the different agencies that are going to be relevant to that person. But for the message here for practitioners is just be very aware of the range of support that's out there from different agencies, and what does the person need. And again, it isn't just about individual practitioners here having to come up with all the solutions. And the final point there is just to underline the importance of the application, the understanding and application of the Mental Capacity Act. So that's really the principles of the MCA should absolutely underpin our practice. We need to be very aware of understanding concepts like assessing capacity for specific decision making, being really clear about what the decision is that needs to be made. Does it need to be made now? Can it be made at a different time? Who are the most relevant professionals who need to be involved? And if we are making best interest decisions, what are the options available to us? And some further learning points here. So again, about mental capacity, particularly when a person is declining services that we might want to offer, that we might feel are appropriate for the person. When we're assessing their mental capacity, we'll be thinking about things like the person's ability to understand, to use and retain the relevant information. And it's incredibly important, of course, that we document all of this and our working out. Services and support should be revisited really regularly. So when we've thought before about the importance of dynamic risk assessments, again, that professional support and working with the person to go back and go back again and go back again. It's absolutely essential that we don't see this kind of work with a person as a one-off. There may be a great number of times that we need to have what might feel like the same conversation with the person, and it's never a wasted opportunity. Sometimes people take a long time to think about things, to come to terms with things, to make different decisions. That's that's quite a natural human response, I think, that we need to be quite respectful of, and it can feel really difficult when practitioners are under great pressure in terms of time and competing priorities. It's really difficult to feel that you are having to make repeated visits to somebody to have what might feel like the same conversation. But it's absolutely essential, and it never is wasted time. We've underlined here again the point about supervision and the need for people to be able to really reflect on this type of work, because it can be incredibly challenging. Managers need to be really aware of the impact of this type of work on practitioners, and to make sure that people have got appropriate support and have had training where that would be helpful for them. There's a need for robust guidance, which is, again, one of the reasons we're here today. And assessment processes, the learning from some SARS is that assessment processes really benefit from taking a wide and holistic approach to assessment to understand who's important to the person. And we know anyway, don't we, that when we're working under the Care Act, there's an absolute duty to involve the person and to involve people who are important to the person. But really taking a whole family approach is absolutely highly recommended from previous safeguarding adult reviews that have taken place. So we'll move on just now to look at the threshold tool, and the low, medium and high risk thresholds. So here are some of the indicators that we might see for a person who's presenting with relatively low risk around self-neglect. So what we might see is some neglect in terms of their property, but there are services and appliances working. There's relatively low or even no risk or impact to themselves or to other people. Risks are manageable. The person isn't at risk of losing their place within the community. There may be some evidence of hoarding behaviour, but there's no significant impact on their health and safety or for other people. No access to support. The person's non-compliant with support, but as yet there's no significant impact on their health, safety or well-being. As we all know, there's a duty around the person's well-being under the Care Act. People assessed at medium risk, so we're stepping up a level here. What we might see is some evidence of the person disengaging from professionals involved in supporting them. There may be some evidence of a lack of insight. Now we know, don't we, that insight isn't really a term that the Mental Capacity Act would recognise. So I think we have to understand that almost as a bit of a layperson's term. That would probably be that might form part of a conversation you'd be having with the person, but that would be pre-Mental Capacity Act assessment type processes. So probably what that means is you might be saying, well, I noticed this with your home, for example, and the person might just have a different view of that or provide a different explanation for what you're seeing. There might be some evidence of a lack of essential amenities, services or food provision in the home. We might see the person collecting a large number of animals and possibly struggling to care for them in a way that might cause us some concern around the animal welfare. We might see some evidence of increasingly unsanitary conditions. There may be increasing risk to the person and increased impact to themselves or to other people. We might see some non-compliance with medication. There may be more of a risk to the person's health and well-being as a result of that. increasing evidence of neglect of a property and hoarding starting to have an impact on the person's health or safety, whether that's a fire risk, for example, will be one example of that, or quantities of items in the house, possibly making it difficult for people to get in or the person to get out. And again, back to animals, well, we talked previously about the animal welfare. This aspect is more about the animals being in a property and impacting on the environment. So possibly that's animals in the house where they haven't got access outside. And I think we all understand what we mean by that. A high risk category really includes a heightened evidence of all of the things that we've just talked about. So we would typically we might see a person who is living in conditions that we might see described as being squalid or insanitary. And some of these terms are quite judgmental. I would really caution against, well, we just need to be very aware, don't we, of the language that we're using and whether that's respectful of the person and their dignity. We might see extensive structural problems or damage in the property, which potentially would be a risk. So that isn't just about cosmetic aspects to the property. It's walls and ceilings being at risk of collapsing. It's that really significant risk issues. So the person might be refusing or declining health care, medical treatment that actually has a significant impact on their health or well-being. So you probably would be seeing significant concerns raised by clinical colleagues. We might see evidence of high levels of clutter within the property, hoarding of things impacting on their person's health and well-being, and again to the extent where it's an actual potential fire hazard for the person. We might see the person's behaviour posing a risk to themselves or to other people. Having seen those evidence of those sorts of things, we might feel that the person's life is actually in danger if there isn't intervention. There might be an appearance of significant malnourishment, so real concerns about sufficient access to food and drink, and the person is, despite our best efforts, not accepting any support or is willing or able to engage in any planning to improve the situation. So in terms of our multi-agency responses, a person's situation that we've assessed at, according to the threshold tool, at either medium or high risk, as we've just described, this should result in a safeguarding adults inquiry and the development of a safeguarding plan. As we've said before, all of these situations must be assessed, taking full account of not just the current situation, but full account of all of the historic information and evidence that we have from previous concerns. And we must document all of this consideration in the outcome. And when concerns around self-neglect are received by the local authority who has the lead role in terms of safeguarding inquiry, then we will undertake face-to-face visits in a timely way to ensure that we have undertaken an effective risk assessment of the person's safety in the community. And just to underline again, it's an absolutely key practice standard in safeguarding adults reviews, not just locally, but nationally. So just a few more points to be aware of here. The threshold tool does outline the range of legal frameworks that might be relevant to supporting the person. As we've said before, you know, examples are going to be things like housing and environmental health. Any intervention that any of us are involved in or responsible for must absolutely comply with the Human Rights Act. There are a number of articles, as you know, under there, but some of the key ones for us in respect to people who are self-neglecting are going to be Article 5, the person's right to liberty and security, and Article 8, that's the right to respect for private and family life. And the Human Rights Act also has a principle of proportionality that we must apply to all of our actions. We've talked a lot about the Care Act, and we've touched on the Mental Capacity Act as well. So where there are concerns around a person's capacity for decision making, we must keep that under continual review. We must carry out and document where appropriate we must assess a person's mental capacity, and where we are following best interest decision making, we must document those too. And just to underline that the principles of the MCA must be applied to any action that we take by any professional. They apply to all of us. So just a few points finally in terms of supporting practitioners. As we've said, this area of work, it can be incredibly rewarding. It can also be incredibly challenging. And all agencies need to be thinking about what the effective strategies are to support practitioners and their well-being when they're working with people who are self-neglecting. So as we've said, reflective supervision, peer support can be incredibly helpful, either when it's a relatively new situation for you and you may not have, perhaps you've recently newly qualified, for example, you may not have a lot of experience of working in this area. So talking to other people who have can be really helpful. But it's important to remember that even when we're very experienced, every situation is different, and every situation also may trigger responses for us from our own histories, our own experiences, our own family members, and we really need to be able to be mindful of those responses and be able to work through those in supervision as well. That's incredibly important. Practice guidance and tools are helpful. Specialist advice and consultation, maybe with other agencies who need to be involved, particularly. You might need to consult with animal welfare organisations, just as another example. Feeling confident and having sufficient knowledge about responsibilities and different options, different legal frameworks is really helpful. Having the time to work alongside people and the skills to build relationships, be able to kind of hold and contain those relationships, be able to ask questions, just developing your practice. Those sorts of skills are incredibly important, and they're the kind of things that will make all the difference to the person that you're working with. And the final point I'd just like to make there is that for all of us, we need to maintain a decent work-life balance that supports our well-being. We might, with the best of intentions, work really, really long hours and do everything we can to support people with the best of intentions. But actually, if that starts to have an impact on your own well-being and you're tired and can't think straight, actually that isn't the way forward. So again, that's back to really good line management, making sure that people are looking after themselves first and foremost, so that they can do the best they can do in supporting people who are out there with care and support needs.